Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Cole. It is Sunday evening, October 30th. Now entering week 11 of Political Science 3753 Constitutional Law for the fall 2022 term. Everyone, what we have over the next week or two is on the syllabus freedom of speech this week and freedom of the press next week. Now, we've sent you an assignment for a quiz this Thursday, the 3rd. And we've given you 4 things to look at. One of them, I've gone ahead and sent you the full text of it via email. The other 3 are articles from the Washington Post. So if you should run up against that publication's paywall, please contact me, and I will try to get the text of those articles to you, any that you may be having trouble with. With any luck, we won't have any difficulty with that. Let me say just a word about what's in the class notes with regard to freedom of speech, and we'll say more about freedom of the press next week. And I'll conclude by touching very briefly on what you're going to be looking at for your quiz. The United States is more absolutist in its protection of freedom of speech than just about any other polity around the world. Challenges have been posed. Challenges often arise in the context of national security. That's one of the first things mentioned in your class notes. Going all the way back to the Sedition Act, passed shortly after the Constitution was ratified, which may appear to fly in the face of the Constitution, especially the First Amendment, and which eventually proved to be impossible to enforce the Sedition Act. But questions arose again in the 2 world wars in the 20th century. You will read about such doctrines as clear and present danger, bad tendency, and fighting words. Please note, freedom of speech in our constitutional tradition extends to and incorporates and goes hand in hand with freedom of association. It may also include actions such as picketing, or actions such as burning a flag or wearing an armband, symbolic speech, or speech plus as it's called in your class notes. There's been some major Supreme Court case law, going back a decade or so, especially to the Citizens United decision, in which campaign finance laws have been litigated as freedom of speech issues. And the court, especially in the Citizens United decision, accepted to a considerable extent the proposition that money equals speech, so that to restrict the amount of money that can be donated or spent in a political campaign, for instance, may implicate freedom of speech, or so the Supreme Court decided in the Citizens United decision. But that's quite a complicated issue area, and we discuss it extensively in the class notes. Citizens United and other decisions that led up to it. Okay. Now, everyone, looking at the quiz material for Thursday, a looming issue in freedom of speech involves so-called moderation of social media platforms, such that the question arises whether that practice amounts to censorship. There really is no Supreme Court case law about it, although there may be. You'll be reading a couple of pieces about that. One of them is the one I had to forward to you through email. Notice its discussion right at the outset. The discussion from the New York Times mentions Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act, going back to 1996. Under the provisions of that act, and it's become quite constitutionally significant, you cannot hold a social media platform like Facebook or Twitter liable for what people post to those platforms. If you thought you were defamed, maybe you could try to get a judgment against the people who posted that alleged defamation on social media, but not the social media platforms themselves. And it's been written that that is a provision that's been interpreted in such a way as to enable the internet as we know it, especially such platforms as, again, Facebook and Twitter. Now, the platforms have engaged in practices that might be regarded as censorship, except that we generally regard censorship as state action. It has to be state action to be censorship. Otherwise, if a social media platform is in the hands of a private corporation or is someone's private property, then whoever the owner is, or whoever the owners may be, have the right to decide what will and will not appear on that platform. Except that the platforms have become so ubiquitous and so important to public discussion, it is argued, that maybe they ought to be treated something like public utilities, or common carriers, as the terminology is used in the law. And if their status were interpreted that way, then perhaps they wouldn't be able to engage in moderation practices quite the way they have. There have been a couple of controversial episodes. The lab leak theory of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, it's been insisted in many quarters that the lab leak, that the virus originated in a wet market in Wuhan, China, where infected animals may have been sold, animals that are used in the cuisine of that area of China that we might not be familiar with, that are bought and sold in so-called open wet markets. But suspicion was aroused because there is a virology institute in Wuhan, China. President Trump mentioned a few months after the beginning of the pandemic the possibility that the virus might have leaked from a laboratory in Wuhan, China. Well, he said that at the same time that he had said a series of other arguably outlandish things. And so Twitter and other platforms regarded it as misinformation and censored any such discussion of such a possibility for a time. Subsequently, it has come out that lab leak theory cannot be completely dismissed. Okay, and those who originally put it forward for discussion were upset, to say the least, that Twitter had moderated its platform so that you, the user, might not be able to see that discussion of the possibility of a lab leak as the origin of the coronavirus pandemic. The Hunter Biden laptop. As the 2020 presidential election approached, news organizations were told of the existence of a laptop originally allegedly belonging to Hunter Biden, the president's son. And it was alleged that the laptop contained evidence of Hunter Biden trying to trade on the Biden family name for the sake of influence peddling in Eastern Europe, including in Ukraine. Now, when the laptop was first produced, mainstream media organizations regarded it suspiciously. They suspected it might have been a Russian plant in an attempt to influence the outcome of the election. And so few media outlets reported on it, and Twitter once again used its moderation policy to censor discussion of it, not wanting to supposedly be complicit in Russian disinformation or a Russian plant or a Russian campaign of that kind. Subsequently, it's come out after the election that it really wasn't a plant. There's authentic information about the Biden family's activities on that laptop. Of course, there's quite a bit of cynicism, to say the very least, that media organizations have admitted this only a few months after the 2020 election. Whereas if it had come out before the election, it might have influenced the outcome of the election. So there's a fair amount of cynicism about that, which suggests to people that maybe there ought to be some limit on the social media platform companies' moderation policies. They ought to be less censorious in what they permit to be discussed on their platforms. And there's a little bit of a left-right element to this, because it is alleged that very often the views that were suppressed by moderation policies were views associated with ideological conservatives. All right, now, then looking ahead to next week in freedom of the press, we have a couple of articles that were both written by Eric Wemple of the Washington Post about libel law. Okay. You'll have two pieces to read. Sarah Palin, former governor of Alaska, former vice presidential nominee, just a moment, you all, brought a libel action against the New York Times. Her libel case was thrown out under libel law as currently interpreted, including the case from way back decades ago, New York Times versus Sullivan, in which it was ruled that to prove libel of a public figure, the public figure had a very, very high burden of proof to bear. Okay, so Sarah Palin's lawsuit was thrown out. Justice Clarence Thomas, and apparently Justice Neil Gorsuch also feel that that decision and that precedent should be reconsidered, because it makes it, they feel, too easy to defame someone and too difficult to win a judgment for libel. So they would like to see New York Times versus Sullivan reconsidered. And you have two pieces from Eric Wemple of the Washington Post, one about Sarah Palin's libel suit, and the other about Justice Clarence Thomas's views about such matters. So we'll have a quiz on all that Thursday. 4 things to read altogether. Expect 2 or 3 items on each of those articles for a total of 10. And you'll have all day Thursday to take that quiz. All right, so quiz on Thursday. Freedom of speech this week, freedom of the press next week. We'll have more to say next week about freedom of the press in particular. In the meantime, look at that material for the quiz on Thursday. Contact me if you have trouble accessing any of it. And we'll have a bit more to say about freedom of the press when we talk to you a week from now this time. Good luck, study hard, and we'll see you in a week.